Welcome back to Melbourne Property TV. Today we're talking about working with your property manager for landlords and tenants. Joining me from Webb Real Estate, Sophie Lyon.
Thanks for having me.
From Infolio, Lauren Staley. And the very beautiful from the Real Estate Institute of Victoria, Larocca. We might start with you, Robert. Just a few quick tips for people who have to work, working in with your property manager, or things to do in choosing a property manager, I guess.
If you're an investor, you have a property out there, the biggest tip is use a property manager. I mean, 2/3, 70% of properties are managed by property managers on behalf of their investors. The others are not. Employ a professional to help you get the most out of your asset. Sometimes property managers are described as asset managers, to try and emphasise that they're actually looking after someone's assets. So, use that professional service in the same way you'd use all those other professional services to get the best outcome. Of course, if you're a renter, the property manager is your friend. They're the first port of call if you're looking for a rental property. They know all the rental properties are out there on their books. They can help you find the right one for you. So, don't treat them as anything other than your friend. Be upfront about what you need. Make sure you've got all your details and, they'll actually help you. That's their job.
Sophie, agree with all that?
I do, absolutely. I think the relationship between landlords and property managers and tenants is a very important one, because we do have to go where we run interference a little bit and try and negotiate on both sides. So having a good relationship with both parties for us definitely makes our life a lot easier.
All right. Lauren, at Infolio, you help people buy properties, but then you manage the property for them.
That's correct.
Does that help you, I guess, because you've got to know them through the buying process?
It's definitely a benefit, because we've worked with those clients for sometimes a period of up to 12 months. So by the time they come over to our management tier of the business, they have some trust in us. They trust what we're saying. They have faith in our ability, and they know that everything that we're doing is actually in the interest of them. And even if that does involve having to upgrade appliances or do work to the property.
Sophie, what's the most common areas of dispute between landlords and tenants?
I'd probably say maintenance would be the most common one, yes.
And which areas? Is it the expense, or is it who's responsible, or...?
Bit of both.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're a first-time landlord, some people forget to take into account that they may have to replace large cost items, hot water services, ducted heating units, air conditioners. So if that isn't factored into their costings, that can put quite a bit of a strain on the landlords. But of course, the tenants are paying rent for a service, so they expect to get that service as quickly as possible. So there can be a little bit of conflict there sometimes. And a little bit of time that it needs to develop that outcome, I guess.
Dispute resolution, Robert. Can it end up at VCAT or?
VCAT there is the last port of call. Renters can access services from Consumer Affairs Victoria, who can help, sort that out if they're unable to achieve a resolution with the property manager at the agency they're at. And then VCAT, of course, exists there as an option, but, that can take some effort as well. And it's always good if you can try and resolve things locally with your property manager first before going down the path of VCAT. That can just make it more difficult in the end, really, for everybody.
Lauren, after you've built up a relationship with someone who's buying property through you, do you have to then make sure that you're not leaning towards them too much in the dealings with tenants, remembering that the tenants have obviously got their needs as well in the relationship?
No, we make it very clear from the outset that you have to look after the tenants. Happy tenant, happy landlord. It's as simple as that. The other thing is dealing with investors. I think there is an expectation that there will be money that has to be spent on the property. It's perhaps not the same as when you've got an owner-occupier who moves out and they've lived in their home forever, nothing ever went wrong, and they get quite devastated when the ducted heating goes. We let our landlords know that generally after each new tenancy, they're going to find that the tenant will report issues that perhaps didn't bother the previous person, and that they need to have a buffer.
And what about when we get complaints? You hear people saying, well, their property manager didn't return their calls, or I would presume a lot of property managers are managing a lot of properties. So they're under the pump. They're probably doing half a dozen different disputes at any one time. What can you do to make the property manager's life that bit easier, and also make sure you're their priority?
It's entirely about communication. I think the only time you have major issues with the way maintenance is handled is if the landlord doesn't know what to expect. They get a bill on their statement that they weren't aware of. Or two, the tenant's not communicated with in relation to timelines where the jobs have been given. if you cover that communication, if everyone knows where they stand and what the expectations are, generally at the end, everyone will be fairly pleased with where the outcome is. If a property manager is looking after too many properties and can't handle those things, well, that's a management issue and you've got to go to the top.
Is that a question you ask when you're looking for a property manager? You say, now, how many do you look after and what sort of areas?
I think it's to a certain degree, but then there also are there's factors in there that do influence how many properties a property manager can manage. It's like the $64,000 question, really. But if they're in a small geographic area, especially like city-based, where they're on perhaps in the large high-rises, they can actually manage far more than you would expect a suburban property manager to be able to handle.
All right. And what about finding new tenants? Because obviously if you've got a high turnover of tenants, what ways are people doing? Is it all through the internet nowadays? Because I imagine a lot of renters are of a younger age group.
Yeah, well, we're a small business, a small company, so we've been actually able to digest a lot of that information and find out where all of our tenants are coming from. And look, 99.9% of it is from the internet, and then you'll get people who like dealing with you, so they might come to you as their first port of call. But the thing with tenancies is a property is generally only on the market for 4 weeks. So tenants usually only on the market for about 4 weeks. So once they've found something they like, they move on. So there isn't the situation of having a huge database of people looking to rent. Well, yes, but it's only for a very short period of time.
If there's a high turnover.
Correct.
I mean, it's an interesting point about getting the right tenant, because the last 5 or 6 years there's almost been a queue of tenants to get into not enough rental properties, and we're seeing a shift over the last year, easing in the vacancy rate, and so that's going to put a different complexion on the role of the property manager, because if someone's got an asset, they need a return on that. The renter is the key to that return, and the property manager is key to managing that relationship. So it'll shift from being on the landlord side of the equation to being on the tenant side of the equation. They have more bargaining power. You might remember when Docklands was first built, people were offering toasters with rental tenancies. That will change the dynamic that we've seen in Melbourne over the last 5 or 6 years.
Lauren, you mentioned before how important it is to have communication with your property manager. I imagine also one very vital thing to do is make sure you keep your paperwork, copies of emails, things like that, so you can clarify if there's ever any sort of dispute.
Absolutely. When we're signing tenants up, when they're moving into a property, we advise them that all maintenance needs to be in writing. Of course, if something really urgent comes up and they want to get on the phone, we'd welcome that phone call, but we'd also ask them to just reaffirm their position in writing, what the problem is, where it started, how long they've known about it, and then we keep the trail of communication via email. That's predominantly how most people like to handle things these days anyway.
That'll be a similar thing with you guys, Sophie?
Absolutely. Having that follow-up and that confirmation, it does, from a property management perspective, that's an expectation that the clients should have anyway, but it does make things a lot clearer along the way, because you can refer back to the information and be able to say, well, hold on a minute, that wasn't the conversation that we had, and it does make it a lot easier to resolve things.
All right. Thanks for joining us, guys. There it is. The key to it all is communication. We'll be back with more in a moment.